Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, we're back with the 12th and final installment of the Apollo Case Study Series. I'm here with a group of amazing behavior analysts, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jim Moore here in just a second. He's going to do introductions, but Lauren Elliott's with us amongst others, and I want to just take a minute to follow up on the last episode that we did on DRO. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I would just go back to that and check that one out. I thought it was a pretty fun episode. What I liked about that episode too is I thought it was very practical, and I think it's something that would resonate to a lot of folks who are out there working in clinical settings who have individuals who have behavior problems and, might fit this type of profile of a learner who would benefit from that intervention. So again, for those reasons and others, I thought that episode was particularly important. So go back and check that out. But I did have a listener send in a few questions for on the topic of DRO, and I'm just they're all kind of related, and I'm gonna ask Lauren to answer them. And so I'm just gonna kind of read them all, and then you can kind of proceed with because I think there's perhaps some general responses that might be applicable to many of the points that the listener made. So here we go. So the question starts with, I was wondering if the learners had access to other reinforcement during the DRO interval besides the item they were working towards. For example, I remember one of the learners earned Google Maps at the end of the interval, but were there other reinforcers the learner was allowed to access before the timer went off? So that's question one. Question two is, if these reinforcers were not available, what did the learner do during the 75-minute interval? It seems so long to go without reinforcement. I was also wondering how they knew if the reinforcer was still effective after 75 minutes. Finally, I was wondering how much time the learner was able to access Google Maps after the 75-minute interval. So all kind of related questions. So Lauren, how would you respond to that?
Sure. So with this particular learner, he's with us the full day. So he gets here in the morning and he's here, until the afternoon. As a reminder to everybody, the DRO runs the whole day. So as soon as he gets to the clinic, the DRO starts and is going until he gets picked up in the afternoon. His daily schedule just continues the whole time. So we didn't change his schedule when we started the DRO. So he's still doing, DTT at the table. He's still engaging in NET, child-led play-based learning activities. We have structured group social games that happen at scheduled times during the day that he participates in with his peers, to work on peer interaction goals and social skills goals. He eats lunch still, all of those typical things that would happen throughout his regular day still happened with the DRO essentially just kind of running concurrent to that. So you can kind of think of the DRO being run kind of overlapping all of those things that are happening simultaneously. So he wasn't, I think last time we kind of joked about like a second grader sitting for 75 minutes and how that's a really long time. He wasn't sitting that whole amount of time. He was engaged in all of these things that he typically does. But the DRO consequences were in place just over top of all of those things. So the implementation of the DRO would take precedence in the sense of if he engaged in any of those behaviors that were being targeted through the DRO, then the timer was stopped, the picture was removed, the consequences were implemented that way. And then the same goes for if he went for the entire DRO interval without engaging in those behaviors, then he would get access to Google Maps, regardless of what he was currently engaged in. So if he was in the middle of a skill acquisition program, teaching was occurring, but the timer went off, we would stop whatever we were doing, give him, specific praise for earning Google Maps, and he would stop the skill acquisition program, get Google Maps for the designated amount of time for that interval. And then as soon as that finished, he would go right back and resume what he had been previously doing. So the DRO was just kind of happening in addition to all of those other things, in addition to his regular day. So he was still earning other reinforcement during the interval, during the DRO interval. It just wasn't Google Maps. Access to Google Maps was reserved just for the DRO. But, he has other reinforcers that he likes to engage with that he was able to access for responding through skill acquisition programming, NET targets, social skills, peer interaction, all of those other things. So he definitely was not going without reinforcement for 75 minutes. It was just different reinforcement that was not Google Maps.
To kind of use our behavioral economics terms, Google Maps was placed on a very specific closed economy. That was his only way to get that particular reinforcer.
Yes. And, his parents were on board with that too. So he didn't get Google Maps at all, aside from through the DRO. And in terms of how we knew if the reinforcer was still effective after 75 minutes, if I'm understanding that question correctly, we started with this particular client, we started at only a 4-minute interval. We had very specific criteria to systematically increase. When we increased the DRO interval, we had kind of planned checkpoints where we also then increased the amount of time that he had to access Google Maps. At 75 minutes, he was still only accessing Google Maps for 3 minutes. And we knew that it was still effective because his behavior was still maintaining at really low levels. So the data, the objective data showed us that the reinforcer was still functioning as an effective reinforcer for him because his behavior was either still on a decreasing trend or maintaining at the low levels that were meeting our criteria.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts related to that answer. Excuse me. First of all, though, I do want to give a shout out to Jeanne Ambrose for sending that question in. She posts a lot of cool stuff on Instagram it's at ABA Natural, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So thank you, Jenna, for the follow-up questions on that episode. And if there are people listening to this one saying, oh my gosh, a 75-minute DRO, go back and listen to that episode to see how these guys got from point A to point B, because it certainly didn't start out that way. And the data for that learner are in the show notes for that episode as well. So the Apollo team was kind enough to share the graph with me, which I put in the show notes. So if you can go to the Apollo case study series number 11 and look at the show notes from that episode, you can see how they kind of proceeded from, start to finish with regard to that intervention and how they wound up at that, what seems to be a long interval, but it didn't get there by accident. And I guess the other thought that I had relative to the timer going off, and even if he was in the middle of doing something that was considered work, that seems kind of cool because it'd be kind of like an intermittent surprise reinforcer as well, and that probably bestowed all the things we know that comes along with that. So thank you for taking a minute to answer those questions. I think sheds more light onto what you guys are doing. So having said that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Jim, because we're going to take like a hard left turn here and go on to a different topic. And I'll let you introduce the topic as well as the rest of the folks joining us here today.
Thanks, Matt. And again, thanks for this series. I can't believe it's our last episode.
I know.
It just started. When we've really thought about the feedback that we've gotten, and I've gone to conferences and talked to people, it seems like talking about mentorship and kind of how we grow RBTs, BCBAs, and help develop their skills, that's been a topic that seems to have really resonated with a lot of listeners. And so I was kind of thinking about somewhat of a return to that, but also one of the things that I often do in my job is quite a bit of time is interview BCBAs. And as we know, the percentage of BCBAs who have been certified in the last 5 years continues to grow as dinosaurs like us are now starting to exit the field and more people are coming in large numbers. So I talk quite a bit with pretty new BCBAs. my most recent interview, not too long ago, the candidate had just passed her exam 10 days before the interview. And so I've seen some trends, and I also have a daughter who's a new BCBA, and talked with her through her process of picking that first job or just making a transition to another job, or even just trying to progress in through their career. And I thought, rather than only hearing the perspective of like the old man of behavior analysis here, you young kids get off my yard. I have the privilege of working with three very seasoned, very outstanding BCBAs who have walked that road and walked it more recently than I have. So I thought that we would bring some of our clinical directors on to kind of talk about some of these tactical issues in making career decisions. Because one of the things that I'm often hearing when we do interview and or make an offer is in the interview process, I notice, hey, what questions do you have? And we often don't get any questions. And I think that's a really important part of trying, a lot of times I think it's easy to think, oh, they're interviewing me. Well, you're also interviewing that employer to see if this is the type of agency you would like to work for. And we often don't get any questions. And I can remember specifically interviewing these three outstanding clinicians. They all had questions, some even more than others. And I think that's a good thing. And what questions should we ask? But then also the other issue that I've noticed is when we've decided that we really want to make an offer to a candidate, by the time we get back to them, they've typically accepted the first offer that's been made to them, almost as if there's this anxiety that I've got to take a job. Because we do, when it doesn't happen often, but when we offer a BCBA a position and they turn us down, we don't have any negative feelings towards that, but we do want to get some feedback and say, hey, why is it that and I think that there are some places out there that kind of take the Mark Cuban on Shark Tank approach. I don't know if you've seen that, but when Cuban makes an offer, he often says, I don't want you to hear anything else. You got to say yes or no to me right now. And he kind of bullies them into making a decision right then. And so I've heard that, well, I was hoping to hear and get an offer from you guys, but this place made me an offer right there. And I kind of felt like I had to take it in case you guys said no. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second. There's, and really, I thought it'd be a great discussion to really kind of talk about that process with BCBAs who have more experience. And then secondarily, these are three individuals who've worked their way into a clinical director role. And that's a role that I'm just seeing just through social media. And that is, you get a lot of variance in the experience levels of people who are taking those positions. And I think that the three professionals we have with us today took a very measured and careful approach to developing their career in a way that led to where they are now, which has also kind of laid the road ahead of them for what will come next on the second half of their career. And so I really thought it would be a good topic, especially for folks in graduate school, new BCBAs. And since I have the opportunity to have such outstanding folks come in and share their wisdom, I thought that would be a great way to close this out. And so we have with us Jeanne Ambrose, Lyndsy Macri, and this is, I guess, your third time, right, Lauren? Lauren Elliott, third time is the charm on the podcast. So Lauren's already done this. Jeanne and Lyndsy, usually what we like to do, and again, given how many people we have, we might have to take the quicker version. But we usually just like new folks to tell us, hey, how'd you get into behavior analysis? And just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. Why don't we start with Lyndsy?
Sure. So my undergrad was actually in speech pathology at the University of New Hampshire. Go Wildcats. And I was getting ready to get into or look into a master's program for speech pathology. And I had a really hard time getting accepted into a master's program in speech pathology in New England. And I thought I had a decent GPA and I was a student athlete and I worked really hard, but for some reason I just was getting a lot of maybes from schools and no confirmations. And I was getting nervous as a senior what am I going to do when I graduate? And I did have some experience working with children with autism. And so I started working at an ABA clinic in Massachusetts, and I fell in love with it. And it came very natural to me. I felt much more comfortable in the ABA space than I did in the speech space. So it was a blessing in disguise. And I went to Simmons in Massachusetts through the ABA center that I was working at, and I got a great education there and continued on to get my PhD in Massachusetts as well. So I fell into the field, but I'm very glad that I did. And it, as closely related as it is to speech, we get to spend a lot more time with our clients than speech pathologists do. And I really see the value in that now. So that's how I fell into it.
So we have a New Englander. Let's hear from someone maybe a little bit further south, a little closer to the equator. Jeannie, tell us a little bit about your journey into ABA.
Well, I took child psychology in my undergrad at UNF, University of North Florida. And while I was there, and I started off with the ambition that I was going to be an art therapist, not what I was going to do. I went to my last semester of my senior year, and I took an experimental analysis of behavior class, and I was like, we ain't doing this no more. So I went ahead and I had a couple friends that were working in a clinic, and they let me come along and kind of see what they were doing. I worked there for a little bit, and then I decided that was what was for me. I feel like most people find ABA accidentally, and it definitely felt that way. So I pursued it. I went to FIT and got my master's there, and I've been hanging out doing it ever since.
And just as a quick poll, Jeannie, how long have you been a BCBA?
Since 2015.
Okay. Lyndsy?
2014.
Okay. Lauren?
2013.
Okay. So we have, combined several decades of experience here. Matt and I could jump that up by almost 50 years combined, probably. It's interesting, Jeannie, you said art therapy, and it maybe because it's a Friday and I'm feeling a little giddy. Most people don't realize that my mentor, Wayne Fisher, actually originally planned to pursue a music therapy master's degree before he found behavior analysis. And if you know Wayne, the first time I heard that, I was like, not what I was expecting. But yeah, it's really cool to hear everyone's story. But kind of now I'd like to talk a little bit about what were some key steps. And I know this is an incredibly broad question, but what would you say were some key steps that you thought were, hey, these were the right steps that have helped me get to where I am today? And Lauren, why don't we let you answer this one first?
Key steps. I think that in the beginning of my career, I wasn't necessarily so thoughtful about how things were going to play out. Certainly not when I was in my 20s. I was just, I think I was finding jobs based on like where I wanted to live at that point. So I wasn't really thinking about key steps. I think I got really lucky that I just found myself working at really great places with really great mentors that pushed me in the right direction. But once I started being more mindful, I guess, of where I was going and where those steps might be taking me, I think that continuing to make sure that I had good mentors wherever I was going really, for me, was hugely important in the things that I've done and the experiences that I've had and where my career has taken me.
Well, and I like how you talked about some of the maybe missteps you took early in your career. We will talk a little bit more about that because I took many missteps, almost like I was trying to walk across an ice rink in slippers early in my career. But I like how it's kind of like you became more mindful. I hope that we don't always have to get it right as long as we keep trying to move forward and we recognize quickly, hey, maybe I've taken a misstep here. But I think the latching on to quality mentorship is important. And I would think that maybe, and I don't want to move away from this question, but it just kind of makes me think, you guys have moved up to a pretty significant leadership position in your career. It's real easy for the number of mentors to start shrinking for yourself the higher you move in an organization. And so I do want to kind of come back and revisit what steps do you currently still engage in to keep that mentorship alive. But Jeannie, what would you say? And I guess we can go ahead and mix the second question, which are what are the missteps too, or what would you say are some of the key steps that helped you kind of arrive to where you are currently in your career?
So I think a little bit of it was luck, finding, people that were very passionate in the field that were able to be mentors to me. But I also think a lot of it is trial and error. So I distinctly remember my first time, literally right out of grad school, getting a job. I didn't really research the places that I was applying to. I was just very excited to get a job. And I do feel like a lot of times one of the best teachers is to make mistakes. And so I feel like a lot of how I got here is by, I would go into something. So maybe not be the next time that I go in, I definitely know to ask like certain more questions, like what are their values, things like that. And then also searching for people that demonstrated more of a passion and things that were closer to my values. So I do think that when you find those people that are mentors to you, that are like passionate, that share the same values of you, those are the type of people that you want to make those really strong connections to. And they're going to help you progress in your field. Whereas same thing, like when you make mistakes, you learn from your mistakes, you keep moving forward with them.
So to follow up with that, I think those are some really good points. And I also I'm making a note to myself to revisit this notion of luck, because now we've heard that twice. And, luck of the draw sometimes doesn't always go your way. And so when you came to us at Apollo, that had been kind of after a lot of this trial and error and kind of this searching and deciding, hey, here's the process I need to go through. So how did you prepare to interview for us differently than maybe your first job?
Well, I looked you guys up and did the research on you. That was a big first step compared to the first time. The first one, I was just looking for kind of any ABA company. I didn't really look at what I thought would be the best fit for me based on just my experience. So first time going out, I went from a very strict clinical setting to straight in home. And that was a very big culture shock for me. And I learned a lot from it. And so I'm very grateful for that experience. But now I know, okay, these are the settings that I have more experience in. Let me ask about like, what environments are we working in? What is our capability to work in different environments? What do those kind of sessions look like? So I'd say compared to my first one, if I'm gonna be honest, for my first interview, I don't remember ever asking questions. I was just very excited that someone called me up for a big girl job. As compared to when I applied at Apollo, I had a couple of years under my belt. I knew what was important for me. And I knew that based on like my past experiences, if I had strayed away from those values, I wasn't going to be happy in the job that I was doing. And I wouldn't be able to provide the quality of services that I wanted to provide. So when I came to you guys, I had questions in place. I wanted to know what the culture looked like. I wanted to know how the RBTs were treated. I wanted to know how you guys made sure that you were growing ethically and consistently. So I had all these things based on my past experiences. So I came in prepared to ask those questions and not be afraid to ask those questions. Because I do think sometimes, especially earlier on in my career, I was really afraid to ask more poignant questions because I was afraid that I would not be considered as a candidate for them.
I think I that really resonates. It's been a little bit, I've kind of stepped out of teaching as much as I have in the past, but it's still pretty recent. And I would hear this a lot, like, is anyone going to hire me? Oh my gosh, I've got these student loans. I've got to get a job. And they put all of this pressure and only to, when you're going to the luck of the draw, well, what if you end up in a place that's a bad culture, doesn't treat their RBTs well, maybe as a mismatch for the clinical model. And so to kind of shift this question and follow it up with Lyndsy, kind of related, clinical model. I remember specifically interviewing you, and you had a lot of questions about our clinical model. What advice, and I do want to also hear about the steps you've taken too, but what advice would you give, especially new BCBAs. Maybe they're just thankful they passed the exam and they haven't even thought. It's easy to think of ABA as this kind of nebulous term and that everybody's doing the same thing. But the reality is we know that there are several nuances within that. So how would a candidate, and what kind of questions could they ask to see not just a culture fit, but a clinical fit? To me, it sounds awful given what I care about, what I'm passionate about in ABA, if I were to find myself working at a place that kind of had the opposite clinical values.
Yeah, I think, it kind of depends on where you are in your career as well. So as a brand new BCBA, I think it's really important to ask what kind of clinical mentorship you're going to be getting. Before I came to Apollo, I didn't have any experience with peak. And so I had seen the assessment. I had learned about it in school, but I had never actually completed it. And I wanted to make sure that coming in as a clinical director, the expectation was not going to be that I would know those things right off the bat. And I think being provided some of that clinical training and support is really important if you're not familiar with the assessment that a lot of the company is relying on as a KPI. So that's just kind of one example. I think the other piece of it too is just, making sure that, as a baseline, is the company using evidence-based practices? What types of assessments are they doing? Are they only doing assessments via telehealth? Are they, only doing the same cookie cutter assessments for every single client? Or are they triaging based on the client's needs and their history? And I think one thing that we do really well at Apollo, thanks to Dr. Moore's guidance, is making sure that when we get an intake packet, we're not just taking that packet and doing the same thing over and over again. We're kind of looking at it and say, okay, what other information do I need more of? What assessments do we think could really, paint a good picture to the insurance company of why this child actually needs these services and so forth. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question very well, but those are the things that I think about personally when I'm, looking into whether or not I would want to move to a company, is what resources are available to me. And am I only going to be expected to fit a triangle into a square just because that's the only assessment that, this company has purchased a license for example?
Yeah, I can remember, I don't know if this is a great analogy. It's going to be yet another way I show how old I am, is when I was out of high school, I was working at a grocery store, and the Coca-Cola bottling company in our area was hiring at a much higher pay rate, trying to take a lot of us and encourage us not to go to college. But it was literally back in the old assembly line days of you're sitting there putting labels on Coke bottles, with a conveyor belt going by. And I can remember going in there and just looking and saying, this looks like the most mindless, awful thing ever. With some of my friends like, oh man, this is great. They're going to pay us X number of dollars an hour, and this is all I have to do. I feel like that when I talk to a lot of BCBAs in my travels, they're on kind of a conveyor belt, or an assembly line. And it's like, nope, it's the same thing every single time. And it's, we don't really vary from this or that. I won't mention the assessment, but we had that discussion just this morning with Jeannie's team. It's like, hey, are we supposed to be doing the X, Y, and Z? And I was like, okay, so there's three things that we got to consider when we use an assessment. One, does it have clinical utility? Two, does it add some longitudinal value to us understanding the quality of our services? Or three, is it just simply that the insurance company makes us do it? And all three answers were no. And I was like, okay, guys, we should be asking this. When it's like, it doesn't matter if it's me telling you to do an assessment or whatever. We should say, okay, why not? You often hear they said, well, we're required to do that X assessment. I'm like, well, who's requiring that? It's definitely not me. Or if it's not the insurance company, it's like, I don't want some perfunctory methodology, because I think that undermines the value of our science. Like, I think the power in what we do is how precise we can prescribe treatments to individual children. And that comes with that same approach, which was just taught to me in graduate school. It just seems like second nature. And I know Matt takes a very similar approach in his consulting work. But also kind of look back to our original question too. It's like, what are some of the steps that you look back on and say, hey, these were right steps that I took from that starting point as new BCBA to where you are now?
Well, one thing that I did a lot of was, really trying to use my resources of who I worked with. So when I was back in Massachusetts, I worked with Dr. Bob Ross, and I was constantly stopping by his office whenever I was in the main building. And I remember him kind of looking at me funny a few times, being like, why is this girl always like stopping by and saying hi to me? And then eventually he'd say, oh, you're the girl that works in Boston, or you're the girl that went to Simmons, or and then eventually he remembered my name. And then I was able to, help with different projects that he was involved in. And so kind of like, I think it's really important as a new BCBA to get to know your executive team and your higher ups, and not to brown nose, but these are people who are in a position because they should be, and they've worked their way into this position. And I think we forget how valuable our coworkers are, even our peers. I mean, having Jeanne and Lauren, if I can't get a hold of Kristen for whatever reason in a rare moment, I have two people who also have such great experience. And so I think that's definitely something that I think I did right early on in my career, is I said yes to a lot. That's a good thing and a bad thing. So I said yes to things often, and I took advantage of every opportunity that was given to me. But what would happen is I would take advantage of opportunities that were given to me that maybe I wasn't prepared for. And then from there, I just worked as hard as I possibly could to teach myself those things if that mentor wasn't present. And I think that that's something that, an early BCBA, as you're getting, like, let's say you are put in, or I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but what you mentioned about clinical directors not having a lot of experience sometimes, like if you are offered a position like that, you just have to be really ready to work. And you're going to have to do a lot of work outside of work hours. There might not be work-life balance at first, but that's okay because you're in your learning period, right? So the BCBAs at our centers, some of them are in and out, and they get their job done in their 8-hour day, but it's because they have systems in place and because they worked really hard at the beginning to create those systems. I don't typically work extraneous hours anymore, but early in my career, I did, because I had to set myself up for success in the future. And I think, when new BCBAs come in and they're like, oh, this is a lot of work. It's like, yes, it is right now because you're still learning, right? It's just because you're out of school does not mean that you are now prepared for all the different things that come with parent training and being someone's manager and things like that. So
I think that.
Can I jump? Excuse me, Jim. I just had I can't resist but to jump in here real quick. And this is kind of a jump ball for anyone, but when you were giving that explanation, it occurred to me to, I guess, wonder out loud that there's probably some level of introspection that's required to know what your capacity is to push yourself in the way in which you push yourself, right? I'm thinking that there might be some people who know that, maybe their goal is not necessarily to be the clinical director. They just like working directly with their team and their clients, and they want to do the best job they can within their particular hours, and then go home and be the best, whatever else you want to be, go to the gym, be a mom, be a dad, play in a band.
absolutely.
Play pickup basketball or what have you, and maintain that kind of work-life balance. And so there might be, some level of self-assessment to see what sort of lifestyle you want as it relates to your professional and personal life. I don't know if that, I see some heads nodding here. So I'm wondering,
I think that's really, really important. And I think Lyndsy brings up a really broad but very, very important area, which is, hey, operationally define what you want for your life and where does your career fit into that. I mean, when Lyndsy was talking, I was thinking back to the early parts of my career, and it was not uncommon at all for me to show up at Marcus at 6 a.m. and then not leave until 6:30, 7 o'clock p.m. That's early in my career. I'm learning. I don't have a lot of the systems in place that I do now that allow me. And I think that that's not, we hear a lot of things that are negative about this and this notion of work-life balance, like it's specific to behavior analysis. Well, the other career that I considered before I went back to college was the grocery business. And the end point of that is to be a grocery store manager, right? They make good money, they get all these bonuses, they have really good hours, but there was a lot of turmoil from, hey, here I am as a manager's trainee, and the number of years and the hours I'm going to have to work and the sacrifice I'm going to have to put in to get to this end point. It's like, yeah, there's going to be several nights where I close the store at midnight and I'm going to be back at the store at 6 a.m. to open it, because that's how the schedule is right now. And I think a lot of careers, it kind of it really, to me, is incumbent on the individual. And here, what I really appreciate about what we've done here at Apollo is we've said, hey, if that is the type of life that you want, here is our kind of minimum expectation as to where we need a case supervisor to be. And if you don't want to go any further beyond that, you want to have this 8:30 to 4:30 life, go home at 4:30 and have a whole life separate from this and stay there, hey, that's fine with us. We still want to help grow you and make you as good as possible, because that could change. They could make a decision as their skill. So I think back to your point, Matt, is like when you're brand new, you don't know what you don't know usually. But as you start having those things exposed to you, it's almost like when a teenager moves out of the house for the first time and they're just so excited about all this freedom they're about to get. And then they start to realize, oh, crap, adult life isn't all I thought it would be. And then maybe they go through that period of, I just want to be a kid again, but you start to grow your skills. And as you start to grow in your skills and experience, that attitude may change. But I really like what Lyndsy said about being in this learning phase, and, it's, there are times now where I feel like at this point in my career, I do have more flexibility just in my time with my family than I did before. But it comes in peaks and valleys. We're about to open another clinic. That's going to necessitate that I am devoting even more time to training more members of our team and things like that. But, had I decided early in my career, maybe all I want to do is just be a practicing BCBA and just make enough money to live a comfortable life and support my family and really have that good balance. And I think that the narrative of work-life balance, it's like, but what if you do aspire, to reach whatever height in this career?
Jim,
it kind of like it takes what it takes.
Hang on. Yeah. So Jim, I was just going to actually give the that exact counterpoint to the example I just mentioned a minute ago. There are going to be people who fall in love with behavior analysis, and they're going to want to pour all their energy into it because they have the time, and especially early stage behavior analysts are, presumably. And at the same time, where people are preaching work-life balance, we I think we also want to feed and nurture those people who do want to go all in. And we don't want to create like workaholics and have all the problems that come along with that. At the same time, if someone's really psyched about serving kids in this capacity, in the ways in which you guys do it, or any other company does it, that we shouldn't. As long as they're not doing it in a way that is counterproductive or leads to deleterious outcomes or what have you, that set of decisions, I don't think should be derided either, I guess. And sometimes I wonder if that message is being sent.
Well, and I think instead of talking so broadly, we also have to kind of put a little definition too. If you're working for a company that has given you such a massive caseload while your skills are still in their developmental stage, you're likely going to find it very challenging to get your work done in an 8-hour day. That's different than what I think Lyndsy and I are talking about.
Yep.
Yes.
So are you working for an employer who makes reasonable accommodations for you if you choose to get your work requirements done, and then maybe you take extra time outside of work to further develop your skills and to hone those skills? I can tell you the thing that will set me off and make me ill is because, philosophical doubt being my most favorite of our Skinner's Attitudes of Science. If I'm right, feel like I've been critically thinking about something, skeptically analyzing it. I feel like, okay, maybe I'm about to hit a new conceptual breakthrough here on something we're doing in Apollo. The thing that will make me most ill is if I'm not allowed to just kind of perseverate on that for a little bit. And so my wife quickly recognizes, no matter if it's the weekend, a holiday, whatever, she'll go, okay, I can see you're thinking about human behavior. So the kids and I are going to go walk on the nature trail for a little while, and you just sit here and stare at the ceiling or get on your computer and read articles or whatever it is. I find that relaxing when I'm in that mode, because I'm trying to develop and continue to grow. I think the opposite of what I just said is if I'm like, I remember meeting a BCBA from Louisiana not too long ago, and he's brand new and he has 35 kids on his caseload. 35.
Wow.
And like, dude, I don't know what to. Yeah, I can see a huge work-life balance problem there.
Mhm.
But if it's people like us and we've fallen in love with the science, I find, my wife tends to fall asleep about an hour or so before I do. And hey, it's a great time to read a JAB article. I find that relaxing. I don't find that as imbalance in my work and life, existences. I really liked those points. Let's we've all kind of hit on this. How do you know? And maybe there's not a great answer for this. Like, I tend to be highly skeptical and somewhat worried when a former student of mine comes back to me and they've got 18 months to 2 years of experience under their belt. They're like, hey, guess what? I just got offered a clinical director role. How do you know, or what does it take to know you're ready for that role? And anybody who really wants to take that question first can just jump on in.
I was just going to say, are you willing to work hard? Are you willing to do it outside of work hours? Are you willing to advocate for your own mentors that might not be at that clinic? Because if they're hiring you in a leadership role with minimal experience, your mentors are probably going to have equal experience in that sense, right? So are you willing to put in the time and the work? It's not impossible. I think we could all agree between Jeanne, Lauren, and I, we were probably put into leadership positions earlier in our career than what we would recommend others do. But we were willing to put in the time and the work and advocate for resources on our own, not be handed stuff and not expect to do it all within that 8 hours, right? So that's my opinion on that. I don't know, Lauren, Jeanne, you probably have something else, but.
No, I agree. I think, at least for me, I was very fortunate enough when I was working in Orlando, the director of the center that I was working at, she let me see a lot of like what she put into the job. So I got a really good glimpse at what all the job entails. And I know, at least from my meetings with her and her helping me understand what the position was, I knew for a while, I was like, I need to make sure that I'm confident enough in my skills that I can be supportive to other people. And I think, having those great mentors in place and knowing like, okay, I feel confident enough in my skills, and you're never going to be 100% confident in your skills, right? It's never going to be, you're going to be like, I am de facto the greatest. It's going to be, you're always ready and willing to learn, but knowing that other people are going to be relying on you, that you are going to have not necessarily just more of a physical load, but like a mental load that's placed on you, a lot more accountability placed on you. And I think when you're really early on in your career, I know it's very difficult to look away from the dollar signs, but those kind of jobs come at a cost. And it's like, yes, you're going to be making more money, but are you going to be able to sustain that life? And I do think a lot of the reason that we see a lot of people moving away from ABA, like they come in, they're very excited, they're motivated. I think there's a lot of very motivated people in the field, is they push into these positions without preparing them for it. And that's their view of ABA. And that's not, it can be so much more. You just need to make sure that you're pacing yourself, you're prepping yourself for those kind of things. So at least for me, I think just making sure that, you know what you're signing up for, and taking the time before you step into those positions to really ask questions, ask for more learning opportunities. That way, when you do step in the position, it's not just like, ooh, everything coming at you all at once.
I try to put the perspective of, hey, if I were 28 years old and I just had a couple of years of experience and someone offered me a pretty significant increase in my pay, I could see how everything both of you just outlined, and what Lauren's probably about to outline too, is like the last thing that's going to cross your mind. But I think about other healthcare positions, like you don't get to leadership roles in a hospital or a medical practice without pretty significant training and experience behind you. And, I know there's been some talk, and I've seen a lot of chatter on social media about the BACB starting to, or the BACB should require some postgraduate supervision, yada, yada, yada. And, and then I think this is just another point where people confuse licensure and certification, because they'll say, well, psychologists have to do that. That's a state licensure requirement to do that. But, we don't have any of those kind of, from lack of a better term, safeguards in place to know you've had these. So I think it's real important, to really hear, it's like, hey, let me just, because the worst career decision I ever made was right out of the gate, and it was all about money. And I wish, every day I could go back and take it. I did recover pretty well from it. It took me a little while, but I remember, Wayne Fisher looking at me and saying, you're going to regret making a decision solely on money. And he was right. And so I think a lot of these things we have to really think about. And maybe if I'm brand new, I'm a little bit younger, I've got some student debt, I'm still kind of adjusting to, paying all the bills and having everything fall on me. I could definitely see if you get offered this big salary, but it really does come with a lot of work. Lauren, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree that it is not inherently a bad thing to be pushed into a position maybe a bit before you're ready for it, if you have the right support in place. However, if a company, to get to your original question, Dr. Moore, if there was a company at 18 months or 2 years offering somebody a clinical director position, I would think that's a red flag. I think that's indicative of other practices that company probably has in place. And that would be a sign to me that there's probably not a whole lot of oversight of the clinical quality that's happening there. I think that, with being a clinical director, we all know that there are administrative and operational aspects to the job. And then there's the clinical aspect where you're responsible for giving guidance to all of the other BCBAs that you're overseeing. And that means you're responsible essentially for, the progress and the progression of all of the kids at that clinic that you're overseeing. And I think that in order to give good, thoughtful clinical guidance to other clinicians, you have to have a breadth of experience to do that, to pull from. And being a BCBA for 2 years, there's just no way that you have that at that point.
I agree that could be such a huge red flag. And, I think some important questions for that candidate to ask is really directly related to what's the maturity level of the agency. how well have they thought through not only how well, because you can't always get it right. Our slogan here at Apollo is, we're building the airplane while we're flying it. But that requires you to constantly adapt and make changes as you see these kind of pressure points came up. I was just thinking while I was listening to you talk, Lauren, Lyndsy was our very first clinical director. And I think about how the role has evolved since we hired her. So in her role, not that any of you don't have any operational duties, because you do, but like if the toilet broke at Johns Creek, that's Lyndsy. Lynsy's got to get that fixed. If anything and everything that happens, it was all falling on her. And we saw that, wow, what's not happening to a level that we're really happy with is her ability to go in and do clinical oversight, to mentor her BCBAs. And so that's when we decided to create operational managers, and in bigger places, even center managers, to help with those, like, hey, food's got to be ordered for this event we're having on Friday. Well, I don't need a PhD in behavior analysis doing that. That's not a very good use of her time. And I don't think a lot of folks consider asking. It's like, yeah, you can see a job description, but it's like, hey, what's the day-to-day going to look like for me? And then how much clinical work am I truly going to be able to do?
That was one of the biggest questions I had when I came on was, am I going to be so far and deep into operations that I am just completely away from the clinical piece of it? Because that's hard. When you move up in a leadership role, your role becomes almost OBM based, unless, working with clients. And that's a hard shift to make when it becomes more of paperwork and fighting with insurance than it does seeing data and looking at graphs. So that was a big question that I had about, what this would look like.
Yeah, you kind of hear, and I don't mean to bring up something controversial, but there's a lot of talk around scaling in ABA, and really the overall narrative is that scaling is likely a bad thing. Well, I tend to disagree with that to a point. And I really feel like when you have a clinical model like the one we've developed, it's really, we have a moral obligation to try and grow that and give that, have more kids have access to that. But with that, it's just a simple fact of the matter that, one person can't oversee all of that. And even at times we have to, so I think it's not necessarily, hey, this agency is growing and they're growing fast. That in and of itself is more of a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have systems or a plan in place to ensure continued clinical quality? And does their leadership team have the willingness and flexibility to consider altering when all things are showing us that this is not producing the kind of outcomes that we want? And I was just telling Jeannie's team this morning, it's like, listen, I understand working for us requires much less flexibility to say, here's your checklist for every kid and every assessment. Just follow the checklist and just do your graphs and get all your stuff in on time, yada, yada, yada. But when we're truly striving to do great work, sometimes you have to know and recognize in your data, hey, we had all the best intentions in starting this key performance indicator. It's not working the way we want it to do, and we have to shift. And, that could cause some unrest because people get very comfortable in knowing what's expected of them. And so you have to think about, how do we communicate this? How do we make sure everyone's on the same page? I think it's doable, but it takes this dedication and this, these ongoing systems to keep pushing this kind of conceptual approach to the ABA down. And I think when I talk to people from bigger companies, they're just kind of all siloed off on their own.
Can I say something about that actually? Because this brings up a good point. I think that's another really important thing, that if you're looking for a job as a new BCBA, like, you need to remember you're in high demand. Like, you are a very desirable employee, and you should, just like you said, Dr. Moore, like, you should be interviewing them, right? And one of the
one of the things that I really reflected on with my time at Apollo is coming from a very large, well-established agency in Massachusetts to, at the time, what was more of a startup. We're not there anymore, right? Like, we've grown a lot. But one of the things that you should really consider as a new BCBA is that, do you want to be a part of a small company? Because a lot of these companies are popping up, and you have to be ready and willing to say, okay, guess what? They don't have a policy for everything, and I need to be flexible. And I think Lauren, Jeanne, and I, we love being a part of creating that at Apollo. We want to be a part of the creation of these policies, or creations of, hey, you know what? We need to fix this. This isn't the right KPI that we were looking at. Let's try something new. But that's not for everybody. And I remind our BCBAs that sometimes when they're like, oh, this is frustrating. We just did it this way. Now we're going to change it this way. But when you reflect on it, it's like, okay, well, we appreciate that we're actually being included in the input of what we do, right? And so it's not we have to do this, it's we get to do this. And making sure that as a new BCBA, do you want that, or do you want the more established company that is going to tell you exactly what to do, but maybe not value your input as much as, a newer company? So that's just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think that gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like, if you're in that kind of situation and there's kind of like these rigid policies and procedures in place, well, what do you do if you're 1 month into that and you find that, wow, I'm just not very culturally or clinically aligned with this, and there's no flexibility, and I think that it kind of gets back to things that people have heard me talk about a lot of, which is, are you a skeptic or are you a cynic? A skeptic is going to take evidence, critically analyze it, and then make the best decision on how to get better moving forward. And, I think that one of the strengths of a small but becoming larger company that we've shown is, we don't claim to know it all or get it all right, but we're going to try our very best to use the best data we can find to do that very thing.
We're not going to jump ship when it gets harder, right? Like, you have to make sure that you're trying, or you just jump ship.
So to kind of shift, we've talked about mentoring, we've alluded to it. We've kind of talked about this potential kind of bottleneck you might encounter as you're moving up in your position, where it could be less and less mentoring. And I definitely feel that. I have to be very intentional with the mentoring that I seek out, or it just doesn't happen at this point. As a clinical director, originally I was going to say, how important is continued mentoring? I think that we've already talked about that. How do you feel you're growing clinically right now? And what are some important aspects to continuing that growth process? Lauren, we haven't had a chance to respond in just a moment. What do you think?
I think that, like we have talked about before, at this point, there's more onus on us, I guess, to seek out mentorship. It doesn't just come naturally always in this position. Of course, we get mentorship from Dr. Moore here at Apollo, which is a fantastic opportunity. And aside, going outside of that, though, I think, and finding other people for specific interests becomes more and more important to have that continued and ongoing mentorship and learning opportunities. Just this week in a meeting that Dr. Moore and I had, we kind of talked about, like, here are the things that I'm interested in learning more about, and here are the things that I'd like to use some of our meetings to talk about that's maybe a bit beyond just the typical things that we talk about in our weekly meetings, but are still applicable and relevant and would be useful to discuss and know about. But I think that creating those opportunities, and like Lyndsy was talking about, using the resources that we have in terms of our coworkers, I think is hugely important too. Having discussions with our peers, I reach out to Lyndsy and Jeanne and talk about things with them. The people that I've mentored in the past too, who are now BCBAs, and some of them seasoned BCBAs at this point too, that relationship is dynamic and has changed. And sometimes those people have experience in something that I don't have, and I reach out to them, and that kind of flip-flops, and they become a mentor to me for, certain topics. And that's really valuable and meaningful at this point in my career.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I'm learning so much from the students, not so much on the clinical side, but more just even about being a supervisor and like, hey, it's okay to be a little vulnerable sometimes and to be a human with your directs, right? And, Lauren and I just went to Linda LeBlanc's workshop on mentorship and this bi-directional mentorship that you're talking about, Lauren, like, using your using your supervisees as mentors when you hit that bottleneck and realizing that, they're going to bring a lot to the table. You also need to kind of like remember to keep an open eye and ear to that, because there's a lot of value in our students who are now just going through some of the newer articles and the new Cooper book, and they're bringing up different topics. And that's been a really cool, humbling experience for me to learn from the students here.
I really like that this notion of vulnerability, because I think Matt and I came up during a time when our mentors were maybe intentionally or unintentionally viewed as infallible and unflappable and and just never made mistakes. And the truth is, to kind of allude to what Jeannie said earlier, there is inherent value, if you have the right mindset, in your mistakes. And it's like I tell our team all the time, it's like, I'm at a point in my career right now where I still make mistakes. I hope that they're fewer, but they still happen. But relative to where they are now, it's probably a lot less. But that's not to lord over them. It's to say, hey, I got this skill set that I have primarily through mistakes and then using the tools of science to correct those mistakes. And to say, hey, I got this wrong. Hey, I screwed this up, or I don't know. I tell you, it's like what I always say to our team. It's like the most important phrase a behavior analyst should be comfortable with is, I don't know. But then followed up with, but I will use the best tools of science available to us to find the best answer we can. And I think that level of vulnerability, when I was able to see some of my giant mentors as people, it made me more comfortable to not, because I can remember a point early in my career where I felt such like razor sharp anxiety about potentially making a mistake. And it affected everything. It affected my ability to sleep. It affected all aspects of my quality of life. And when I was able to see them as just people, just like the rest of us, and, that they don't always get everything right too, but it's their approach to those mistakes. And we kind of have, I'm a little concerned that we have this narrative growing, and we do this with learners sometimes too, that we have to shield everybody from mistakes. And we have to shield everyone from having aversive experiences, when if you pull out most leadership books outside of behavior analysis, what do you see those people say? The most important thing that happened is something bad happened and how I learned to respond to it. So I think that those and I think showing your team, hey, I am a real person, I am approachable. Lyndsy told me the other day, hey, we've got this tech that would really benefit from talking to you, but she's terrified of you. I'm like, well, we got to fix that right away.
Right.
I'm a big, scary looking guy, maybe, I don't know, but there's really nothing to be afraid of, and to really kind of disarm that so that she can benefit from whatever it is I can offer. Jeannie, what do you think right now are big areas for your personal mentoring that are helping you continue to grow clinically?
Well, I think one of the things that I really value about Apollo is that everyone seems very open to feedback and to like help each other out. So even like Lauren was saying, like she had a conversation with you earlier this week. We just had a conversation earlier today with a client that is having behaviors that I am not familiar with. And so it's really, really important for me to be able to have somebody that I feel comfortable reaching out to. And I think also too, when you're looking for someone that is going to be mentoring you, and one thing that I do appreciate about Apollo is it's not always just going to be like, well, you're doing good. This is like, well, here, let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try this. It's never necessarily like this is going to be the answer to your problem. It's let's work this out together so we can come to find a solution together. Because that's also how you learn, right? You need to have some of the input in it as well. So I think that, you know, I get a lot of mentorship from you. I get a lot of mentorship from Kristen Vaughn. And I think having that open communication, especially not just among you guys, but also with Lauren and Lyndsy and even the BCBAs that I have here. I think Lauren and Lyndsy also made a really good point earlier about, taking, the mentors or the mentees becoming the mentors. And I'll say I have a lot of very new BCBAs at my center and I learned so much from them. And I don't feel like I've been out of school that long. I guess it has been a while now, but it's always, I think, being open. And again, like having, keeping your scientific principles in place, but having an open mind to how people perceive things differently, how they approach things differently, just to expand your own repertoire, I think is a big part of it.
I think that alludes to something that I think a young BCBA can easily ask in an interview. Like, hey, when's the last time a change was made based off a junior member of the team's recommendation? Because, before any of you got here, one of the biggest tasks that I faced at first was creating a culture where our employees felt safe to even voice concerns. And it's not because of the culture. We were brand new. It was because of everything they had already experienced in the field, like asking a question in graduate school and being made to feel like a fool or whatever. All the bad things that we've heard that some of us have experienced in the field. And to say, hey, if this philosophical doubt, skeptical, continuous improvement thing that we're trying to do is going to work, that means everyone has to feel safe to ask questions, to make suggestions, to provide feedback. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to act on the feedback, but are you going to be heard? And I think that, I think another thing, just as a point that I think is reasonable to ask is, hey, as part of my interview process, can I talk to one of your current BCBAs? And I would ask those questions. How heard do you feel when you have concerns? We recently just got our staff survey back, and the thing that made me so excited was we had a question, I know how to get support. And across the board, the whole agency, all of our employees either agreed or strongly agreed. And that feels really good because that's the kind of culture that if you're going to try and scale and get larger, you have to have that in kind of the DNA of your culture, or else things will start flying apart. And folks like me who are kind of, on the executive team will be oblivious to it if we don't have a culture where it's like, hey, I really appreciate, one of the things, not to get too in the weeds, but, when I was meeting with Lyndsy earlier this week, we were talking about, things about her leadership. And she shared with me how she opened up the floor to allow a BCBA to give her feedback. And as I sat there and heard her describe it, I was like, I don't know many BCBA Ds that would have allowed that and sat there, not only allowed it, but actually openly considered, hey, maybe I need to do better with this, or maybe I could have done something differently. And I think that that's huge to have that as a leadership repertoire. And if you're looking to join an agency of any size, let me tell you, the small ABA clinics are not all nirvana. You can get in there with some really nasty cultural things going on there, and to see what is how open is this agency to feedback? How quickly are they to act when problems are known and demonstrated? And does the team feel heard? I think those are all really, really great points. Really, to kind of get into maybe some of the less exciting things. Obviously, the two big factors that we hear now when people early in their career are making decisions, salary and convenience. We see this trend now of people wanting to have some, hybrid or remote jobs or things like that. But there's really so much else other than what we've just talked about. Like, how much PTO do you get? What's your caseload going to look like? What's the culture like? What are some other things that if you could go back and tell your younger version, hey, ask these things in your interview. And not only that, how do you weigh and compare options? And I really hope our listeners will hear that. It's like like Lyndsy said earlier, you are a highly valuable commodity right now. Don't allow yourself to be pressured to say yes that day. I mean, how do you make an informed choice if you're only considering the first offer that's been made to you? But so what are some other things? And I know I haven't gotten the whole like health benefits, all of these things that you have to consider. I think Jeannie said earlier, treatment of RBTs, how are you growing ethically as a company? What other kind of big things would you really recommend our listeners ask about in these interviews?
When I think about when I moved here to work at Apollo, that was a big move to move from Boston to Georgia when I had never been to Atlanta. And so I really had to be thoughtful in that interview of who is this company and what do they offer? And I really had to interview Apollo too, just to make sure I wasn't moving my life across the country for a poor decision, right? So one of the things that really stuck out to me to this day, and I tell this story a lot, was during my interview. It was a day-long interview, and halfway through the day, I remember Kim walking me into a room with not much guidance, and Jeannie's laughing because she was in that room, and it was all of the BCBAs that worked at that clinic. And Kim goes, "I'm just going to leave you in here for a little bit. Ask the BCBAs if you have any questions and things like that." And they had an opportunity to interview me, and I instantly felt relief because it's just transparency. You can tell, when you go into an interview and someone's trying to sell you on that job, you can tell. It almost feels like it can't be, this is too good to be true. It can't, the CEO is telling me all these great things because he really wants me to work here, but it's too good to be true. He left me in that room. He did not come into that room with me. He gave me the opportunity to see that. And we do that to this day with BCBA interviews, where we will walk them into a session and we will leave them in there just so they have the opportunity, so that they don't feel like we're, watching over and what's being said and everything. And I thought that was really awesome. And that's kind of what helped me make my decision about Apollo, because I thought they really value what their BCBAs think about who is going to be leading their team. And that meant the world to me. That's a very rare thing. They even put me in there with an HR representative, and I thought that was great too. They admin staff, right? Like, they wanted me to meet everybody.
Yeah, I said, hey, I asked to interview one of the BCBAs, and that's something we've been really intentional about. And that's not just for the applicant. It's for, when we hired Lyndsy, we had to put a lot of thought behind the fact that from a clinical perspective, this team was getting their guidance directly from me every single day, and not to say that it's like this horrible transition from me to Lyndsy, but those types of transitions can be hard. Yeah. It's always, in my first chosen career, which was band directing in the music field, I always just marveled when I'd see these horrible band directors leave a school and then all the kids quit. Like, quit band. I'm like, you just got rid of the tyrant. Why are you quitting? You got a better director now. And there's often, and I've seen even in this field, you get rid of a really bad manager and you still have turnover. And so we thought it was really important for our team to see, hey, here's who we're considering becoming your immediate leader. And yeah, I know you valued it as an interviewee, Lyndsy, but our team valued it as well, because there was a lot of uncertainty, because we're like, okay, how's this going to work? And
Jeannie was there.
Yeah, I was about to say, I was part of that circle, and I remember thinking it was such a novel thing. I had never experienced something like that before, where it showed not only, trust in the company itself, but like trust in the BCBAs, where it's like, we trust you to have this conversation and like be on, like, because we want that transparency. And that, I thought that was really impressive. And I remember, like, when you first walked in, I was like, oh, I thought like Kim was going to stay. I thought it was going to be like, I was like, oh, that's rough. But like, I remember, like, it was such a good conversation that everyone had. It felt very natural, and it felt very honest. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about here too, is just the transparency and the honesty.
Well, how about we end the discussion? I think that there's been a lot of really good pearls of wisdom that our listeners, especially those younger in their or earlier in their careers, can take. But I want to just kind of end with maybe something a little fun, and it can be as short or as extensive as you like. What is the part of your job as a clinical director you love the most?
I'll go first.
All right.
So we have clinical rounds each week where the BCBA and I will meet. We'll go through data. But what I love the most is it just happened yesterday. There's a whiteboard in my office, and one of the BCBAs and I mean, we were like climbing up the wall, scribbling all over this whiteboard, getting down to just like the 3-term contingency of what was going on with this problem behavior, and getting into like the nitty gritty of, you know, why is this happening? And it's not anything like, it's not magic. Like, it goes right back to what we learned in intro ABA. But what I loved about it was my door and my blinds were open, and students and RBTs were walking by, and they were kind of peeking in my office, and they're looking at me and Billy, and they're like, what are they doing in there? Because we're like, and then this, and then that. And we're, you know, climbing the walls, like writing all over the place. And they're like, you know, it just, we care about it and we love nerding out on it. And so we get really into it, but it's a really cool thing to see, because it's nothing, doesn't take a PhD to figure out. It was just the 3-term contingency, you know? So
see, what I love about that process is, you know, I'm not even a part of that, but I've been kind of preaching this parsimony narrative since I started. And that doesn't mean it starts simple. It means you go through this process and you start eliminating. It's like when I talk about this to others, I have this slide about how physics and their basic understanding of the universe has evolved, and it gets really big and complex. And now it's starting to become more simplistic. And that sounds like exactly like what you guys did. And I believe that, you know, when you see something, like if you watch a virtuoso, no matter what it is, Michael Jordan playing basketball, you know, Neil Peart playing drums, Tom Brady throwing a football or whatever, it looks effortless, right? There's so much simplicity and beauty. And I believe parsimony produces elegance. But the process of getting to that really sometimes means you got to get it all over the wall. My wife says, I hate when you're trying to figure something out because I got to come to a wall full of sticky notes everywhere. It's not like conspiracy. I'm not like the conspiracy theory guy with all the threads attached to it, but it's like, hey, I've got to take it. I got to put it all out here first. And I got to kind of take, you know, in philosophy, parsimony is called Occam's razor. I literally sometimes think of myself as like, let me chop away all the unnecessary stuff and get to the beauty and elegance that parsimony produces. That's great. Jeannie, what would you say is your favorite part of your job?
I think probably the training component. Like I love, especially for like the newer BCBAs, like helping them transition from they were just RBTs or therapists and moving into that position. So I do really like kind of helping them grow, learn the procedures, things like that. But I also really like the problem solving aspect of it too. So like when we, just like Lyndsy said, when we do our 1-to-1s or they come to me and they're like, hey, we've been seeing this, just really talking it out, parsing it out together. And again, just trying to figure out how to best tackle something that, you know, is going to be effective for the client, but also how we're going to train the team on it. So kind of like triaging these kind of problems just to make sure that like the team's on board, the family's on board, the kids on board. Those are probably my favorite parts of the job.
Lauren, what about you?
You know, I think all of us on this call are probably all in the positions that we're in because we love behavior analysis, right? And we love talking about it conceptually and having these discussions with each other. So my answer really is, you know, similar to Lyndsy and Jeannie's. I really miss being in grad school. I loved being in school and having a group of people that I could have these theoretical conversations with, and finishing grad school and, you know, being just in a job was a huge kind of shift for me to not have that community anymore. And I, fortunately, I went to an in-person program, and I, was still in touch with all of those people, and still am with a lot of them, and still have those people from grad school over a decade ago that I have those conversations with. But I feel like now being a clinical director is a really unique opportunity to have this group of people, group of BCBAs here that can kind of be like a grad school conversation again, and have these really fun conceptual conversations with in our weekly meetings as a group, or like Lyndsy said, when there's something that we're, trying to figure out, and just spending time talking through all of it and having that bigger kind of conceptual discussion, but then bringing it back to the specific client we're talking about, or the specific issue that we're talking about, and really just working through that and figuring that out. And then, like Jeannie was talking about, training people, being in the position where, like, getting to kind of guide that clinician to figure out the resolution is really fun and reinforcing for me.
Yeah, I think that, I know all of us invest some of our own time into developing our technicians who are in graduate school. I had one of our newly minted BCBAs come to me and say, "Hey, can I still come to your graduate student group? Because I really like how you let everybody kind of talk, and we have these kind of nerdy discussions about conceptual issues." I'm like, "I don't care. Why not?" And I think that, so it's really interesting because I guess, Lauren, I never really thought of that, about what a hard shift that is, because my landing was a little bit smoother, because I got to go from graduate school where I'm nerding out with all these people to then the Kennedy Krieger Marcus connection of, like, now you're really talking about this with everybody. Everybody in your life is wanting to geek out on behavior analysis. And then my first job out of graduate school was with the May Institute, which is also a very behavior analytic company. So it was like several years before I felt that blow. And I never really kind of recognized until I just heard you say it. It's like, wow, now I'm back in a position where I do kind of get to geek out and talk conceptually and train our team on new conceptual stuff. And that we have a platform where we get to bring in outside trainers, like Jen Austen and Mark Dixon, and next year, Doug Greer. I can't wait for his talk and talking about verbal behavior developmental theory. It's like, we've allowed that to be part of our culture. And I think that's why, even though it's sometimes overwhelming, we have close to 40 graduate students here at Apollo.
Wow.
And that's a great problem to have. And they're being raised in a culture of, it's not just about billing. It's about understanding the science of human behavior. And I really love to hear all three of you and your perspective on all of these topics. I think a key aspect to look for is intellectual curiosity and humility. And I really appreciate that all three of you approach your jobs in that way, because I've seen the exact opposite, where it's like, yeah, I'm the clinical director. I am the holder of all correct knowledge, and that's just not true. I still think that what we currently know about human behavior is vastly outweighed by what we still have to learn. And I love the fact that you guys approach your positions with that humility and intellectual curiosity, because it's going to help us do some really cool things.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This has been a really fun conversation. And I think more generally, just about this series in general, I very much appreciate, Jim, you in particular, since you've been involved in nearly all the episodes, and everyone else on the Apollo team, for kind of letting the behavioral observations audience into the inner workings of the company. It's kind of a unique experiment, and very grateful for the opportunity to learn about what you guys do, and to recognize that so many of the things that you folks are grappling with are applicable to everyone else out there in ABA world. So, having said all that, thanks so much for spending all this time with both myself and, by extension, the audience.
Well, we really appreciated the opportunity. I know our original intention and hope was, maybe it was a pipe dream, to do one episode every month for 12 months. And of course, life didn't allow that. But now I'm kind of thankful because it's like we have these little time capsules now where we can go back and now see, it's like, okay, I remember where we were developmentally as an agency when we recorded this. And now let's see how we've grown. It's like, wow, this is some really great archival evidence of how, are we really doing are we trying to do what we say we're trying to do? And, Christina Nylander, who was on our last episode, she actually shared with me, I don't know if you did this intentionally, Matt, that her second appearance on the podcast was released on the exact year to the date of her first initial appearance. And she was like, she made the comment about, wow, I can't believe how much I've grown as a behavior analyst since I first appeared. So though we intended to get this knocked out 12 and 12, I'm a little thankful that it didn't turn out that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's no way I could have landed on 365 days on the dot. So that would require a level of organization and sophistication that is not currently in my repertoire. But I'm glad Christina appreciated it nonetheless. All right, folks, thanks again for a fun podcast episode. I know the listeners will get a lot out of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.